Today's video has been made possible by Exter, the innovators who revolutionized the way we carry our essentials. Exter, renowned for creating the world's first trackable wallet, is on a mission to upgrade your everyday carry. They've taken the next step in innovation, crafting sustainable wallets, bags, and accessories designed to enhance your daily life. Meet their super slim wallet, half the size of conventional wallets, yet it holds over 12 cards and your cash effortlessly. Experience quick card access like never before, thanks to their signature trigger mechanism. Worried about data theft? Fear not. Their built-in RFID blocking protects you from wireless skimming and data theft. But that's not all. Exter's solar-powered tracker lets you keep tabs on your wallet's location right from your phone. Use the two-way ringing feature or receive separation alerts. Just 2 hours in the sun equals 3 months of charge. Don't wait any longer. Upgrade your everyday carry with Exter and join the future of smart and sustainable essentials. Don't wait any longer. Upgrade your everyday carry with Exter and join the future of smart and sustainable essentials. For being part of this community, by using the code POLITIK at checkout and using the link in the description, you can get up to 45% discount for Exter's New Year sale. Think about it. If we asked any of you why North Korea is so poor, I'm pretty sure that in most cases, the short answer would be very clear. It's obvious, Josh, because it's a communist country. However, that very answer has a catch. Why is North Korea so much poorer than, for example, China or even Cuba? Why is it a much poorer and more backward country than the Soviet Union or Tito's Yugoslavia was? And not only that, VisualPolitik community, it may surprise you, but North Korea was not always such a miserable country, nor did it always have the levels of extreme poverty that it now suffers. What's more, there was a time when North Korea was viewed as a kind of model of socialism in the socialist world, and South Korea, on the other hand, as a poor and corrupt blot on the capitalist world. North Korea even, hold onto your chair, went so far as to donate food to South Korea, something that, these days, seems totally crazy.
North Korea delivers flood aid supplies to South 370. Open trucks dropped off tons of rice, medicine, and cloth that the North had volunteered as relief aid to victims of recent floods in the South.
At that time, in the early 1980s, North Korean grain production exceeded 10 million tons per day. Today, it is less than half of that. In fact, North Korea has suffered such a debacle that nowadays, not even the staunchest supporters of communism would dare to boast about the economic or social development of this country, unless of course they are fans of the absurd. Now, why do we say that North Korea was a model country for the supporters of socialist revolutions? What has happened since then to make this country the opposite today? What are the main reasons for the severe and widespread levels of extreme poverty there? Well, VisualPolitik viewers, we're going to answer all these questions in detail in this video. So let's get going. Let's see. When we say that communism is not the only thing that explains the extreme poverty in North Korea today, we have to look at the past. Specifically, to that dark period of the 20th century when the world was divided into two large blocks, the capitalist side and the communist bloc. And pay attention, because in this video we are not going to tell you that North Korea was richer than South Korea until almost the mid-70s, because you will have heard that many times before, even on this channel. However, what you may not have heard as much about is that until about 1993, and that's not so long ago, North Korea surpassed China in GDP per capita, which could be interpreted, greatly simplified, to mean that it was a richer country. Let me repeat. 1993. That really wasn't that long ago, especially if we take into account the abyss that separates the same two countries today. Because we can basically say that this hermit country went from being the best student with the best grades in the communist orbit to not being able to pass even a single test. Well, one of the aspects that is not often talked about is that within the communist bloc, there were also significant differences between countries in terms of wealth and development. And yes, North Korea was among the wealthy and advanced students of the time. Within the reality of the communist bloc, we are talking about the 1960s, and above all, the 1970s. What's more, in the 1980s, North Koreans were somewhat richer than they are today. Yet this country is no more communist now than it was in the 1980s. So there has to be an explanation. What What on earth has happened? What could explain the extreme poverty that has plagued North Korea for decades? Well, in order to understand the fall of this country, I think it is essential to first understand the rise, the ascent. Because yes, the truth is that North Korea had relatively happy times. And to a large extent, what was done and how it was done then determined the result we know today. VisualPolitik viewers, get ready to be surprised. Stay tuned.
The model socialist country.
The Korean War, which pitted the two newly formed sister countries, North and South Korea, against each other between 1950 and 1953, destroyed almost everything and plunged the two states into a massive economic and humanitarian crisis. At that time, the exit of one country or the other from the war, economically speaking, was seen in a certain light as a way of demonstrating which of the two systems, the capitalist or the communist, was better. Today, this may seem outrageous, but at the time, there were some doubts. Even among many intellectuals and academics in the Western world and in the United States itself. For this reason, the two great powers of the time took giving aid to their respective Korean ally during the post-war period very seriously. The United States and other Western allies helped South Korea with an outpouring of money and low or no interest loans. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and China also flooded North Korea with money, specifically between 1950 and 1970. They deployed some $2 billion at the time. And on top of this must be added an enormous amount of resources that were key to the reconstruction of the country and also to North Korean industrialization. In order to achieve its set objectives, to industrialize at full speed and win the race against its southern neighbor, the North Korean state made use of several formulas. On the one hand, the traditional economic planning that is characteristic of communist dictatorships. On the other hand, the creation of a social movement to support all its objectives. Well, the plan was initially relatively successful. The 5-year plan of 1957 to 1960 managed to solve the major post-war food and housing problems and left the country ready to leap into production, mass industrialization, and development. Or so it was thought. Between 1953, when the war ended, and 1958, the average industrial growth rate in North Korea was 43% per year. Despite this, the street-level economy was not developing at the same pace. To fix that, in 1958, the Kolyma movement was created, a version of Soviet Stakhanovism which was interpreted as North Korea's competition to Mao's Great Leap Forward. However, unlike what happened with the Chinese Great Leap Forward, there is some consensus that the Kolyma movement had some success. The aim of the plan was above all to increase the productivity of workers. In order to achieve this, hardly any material compensations were introduced, but production targets were set, even doubling production year on year, and the best workers were presented by the propaganda outlets as having superhuman qualities and as being true heroes of the people. And the truth is that the plan partially worked. Industrial and agricultural production did not double in 1 year, but Kolyma had an effect. For example, industrial production, with special attention to steel production, grew 53% in 1959 over the previous year. Workers began to lengthen their working hours to 10 and 12 hours a day, and began to work on weekends and holidays, all to achieve the objectives set in the framework of an enormous patriotic fervor. Be that as it may, the point is that in the 1960s and 1970s, the country was doing reasonably well, considering where it had started from. In the 1970s, it recorded year-on-year GDP growth rates of more than 10%, with years in which it even approached 25%. At that time, agricultural production was developing to triple its output in little more than a decade, and cheap oil was arriving from Soviet Union, along with industrial technology from the German Democratic Republic and other Eastern European countries. All this facilitated the development of a much more advanced industry that was available in South Korea or China at the time. In fact, between the early 1970s and 1985, nominal GDP per capita rose from $384 to $836. Yes, it was still a very low level, but to give you an idea, China only managed to break the $600 per capita mark for the first time 10 years later, in 1995. Also, Pyongyang was experiencing rapid urban growth. New industries were setting up around the capital, and the city had become a socialist model. very wide and clean avenues, manicured gardens, fountains, streetcars, subways. Everything seemed to be going reasonably well. There were few, if any, cases like this in the communist world at the time, and for many, what was happening in North Korea was almost a miracle. The rapid growth of that period was accompanied by an increase in life expectancy to 70 years, and a reduction in the infant mortality rate from about 120 children per 1,000 to about 30. Even in the 1980s, Pyongyang became one of the fashion capitals of Asia, with great influence in China and other countries of the socialist orbit at that time. But not only that, the other cornerstone of North Korean growth in the 1960s and 1970s, in addition to the steel industry, was also mining. Minerals such as magnesite, which is used, for example, in the steel industry or in construction, zinc, tungsten, and iron. All of them were used not only in North Korea's own industry, but were also exported in large quantities in exchange for foreign currency, oil, and technology. As a result, if there was one communist country ready to take off at that time, all eyes were on this country. Of course, all this allowed the country to have a certain international relevance in the socialist world, an influence that Pyongyang exploited, and, what's more, hoped to expand beyond the other side of the curtain. How? Well, you see, North Korea wanted to develop its own version of globalization in the 70s and 80s, a model that sought to turn the country into a sort of bridge between the countries of the communist bloc and the non-aligned countries. And so, North Korea began to strengthen ties and promote business with African countries, such as Algeria, and also with others in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. They even established relations with some Latin American countries and supported revolutionary or anti-colonial movements in Africa. All this may seem contradictory to those of you who know something about North Korea. After all, the Juche ideology, which is the indigenous North Korean version of socialism, is based on autarky. And you are right, but the reality is a bit more complex. As we've seen, North Korea was not a country that was massively successful, but, well, it was more or less a good place to live, in the communist context of course. And it certainly was worlds apart from its current situation. There was a certain halo of prosperity. So then, how and why did it come to this sorry state of affairs? How did a reasonably prosperous country by socialist standards end up suffering one of the worst famines of mankind in the late 1990s? What key mistakes were made to turn it into such an impoverished and backward country? Well, here we tell you all about it. I'll tell you right now that if North Korea's history were a movie, this would be the precise moment when the world would get tense and we would all start to suspect that something bad was about to happen. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Listen up.
The reasons for failure.
North Korean political ideology is marked by a doctrine, its own version of communism, imposed by the dictator Kim Il-sung, Juche. Juche, in practice, implies the adoption of autarky as a way of defending sovereignty and revolution. We're talking about a system that is a kind of mixture between I do it myself and I don't need anyone's help, seasoned with tons of communist theory. That is Juche, a philosophy that may sound great in theory, but in practice is much more difficult than assembling a piece of IKEA furniture without instructions. But stop! Wait a minute, because in spite of all this, as we told you earlier, North Korea traded a lot with other countries of the socialist bloc. Not only were goods imported and exported to these countries, but also a great deal of money was borrowed from other communist countries as well as from Western and even Japanese banks. Pyongyang had operations with more than 100 banks in 17 countries, particularly during the 1970s. This money was intended to finance the expansion of mining in the country, construction, and food imports. Mining, in addition, was basically being doped with more production to counteract the fall in prices that was occurring with some of the minerals exported by the country. The sector had become a kind of golden goose for the Pyongyang regime, and the only way to continue obtaining resources from abroad in a context of falling prices was to expand production more and more. Obviously, this was a lousy idea. Soon, the North Koreans began to be unable to repay the loans. Their debts were rescheduled in 1977, 1980, and 1984, and North Korea ended up not being able to pay its loans. That is, going into default. This was the first reason for the beginning of the end of North Korean optimism.
North Korea is told of loan default. The total amount of principal and interest owed is about $770 million out of about $1.65 billion to $2.75 billion that North Korea is believed to owe to the non-communist world. The rest is mostly held by Japanese banks.
The capital and interest accrued with financial institutions now amounts to approximately $3.6 billion US, and that is taking into account a large write-off with Russia, amounting to 90% of the debts with this former communist party, amounting to 90% of the debts with this former communist partner. In total, the country's foreign debt is between $6 billion US and $15 billion US, according to the International Journal of Korean Unification Studies. But let's not get sidetracked. The fact is that the non-payment was so severe that it left such Dante-esque situations as this.
North Korea's never-paid-for Volvos still going strong after nearly 50 years. The Swedish National Export Credits Guarantee Board, EKN, estimated the outstanding debt on the 1,000 Volvo vehicles North Korea ordered nearly 50 years ago at 2.9 billion Swedish krona, $267 million. The initial purchase agreement was 600 million krona.
And I know what you are thinking, but Josh, no country starves to death and is indefinitely frozen in time for 30 years simply because it has debts. There must be something else. Yes, you are right. To say that North Korea is stuck in time just because of unpaid debts would be like saying that a party is ruined just because the ice runs out. It stands to reason that there must be more factors. And yes, the truth is that there are a lot more. Apart from being incapable of adapting their productive model to global changes, other fatal mistakes were made along the way. Mistakes that have a lot to do with the lack of market perspective, the lack of supervision and oversight of those in power, and, of course, corruption. Two key elements go a long way toward explaining why North Korea is in such a dire state today. The first is that in the 1980s, unlike the rest of the communist world, there were no substantial reforms in the economic and political system in North Korea, something that, for example, did happen in its two mentors, the Soviet Union and China. That left the North Korean economy out of globalization and without investment, meaning that its competitiveness gradually plummeted. The new Chinese factories were much more productive thanks, among other things, to ties with the West. And so North Korean companies and industries began to either disappear or become so outdated that they were no longer able to compete. As a result, their exports plummeted. Let's just say that while their Chinese and South Korean neighbors were opening their doors, receiving foreign investment and technology, North Korea was completely left out of that process. In other words, while China and South Korea were catching up with the modern world, North Korea was like that guy who refuses to stop wearing bell-bottoms and listening to cassette tapes. On the other hand, the second, and perhaps more important reason, is that, starting in the 1970s, and pushed even further in the 1980s, North Korea began a huge program of military expansion. This program was aimed at achieving full military independence for North Korea, so that it would not be dependent on either the Soviets or the Chinese in the event of war. The effects of this decision were twofold. On the one hand, an enormous amount of resources were diverted from the civilian economy to the military, and on the other hand, the development of new infrastructure that would strengthen the productive economy was neglected. For example, the road network, ports, and water infrastructure were completely neglected, which made North Korea very sensitive to droughts and floods. This was the breeding ground for what came later, the arduous march. Although we will talk about that a little later. The fact is that the militarization of the country began to take a worrying turn. In 1993, with the communist bloc already collapsed, North Korea announced its intention to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and all this despite the fact that it had ratified the treaty 8 years earlier. In 1994, it cancelled its withdrawal, but in 2003, it ultimately ended up pulling out of the agreement.
North Korea withdraws from nuclear treaty. Pyongyang said it was reactivating the Yongbyon facilities to retaliate for Washington's decision to suspend oil shipments after the North revealed the existence of the other clandestine nuclear program.
VisualPolitik community, the Pyongyang regime began to pursue weapons of mass destruction at any cost. And this was a fateful decision for its ailing economy. You see, in the late 1990s, the country suffered a huge famine that killed between 500,000 and 2 million people, depending on the source. And even in that situation, the government never stopped diverting money for military development. It even went so far as to put obstacles in the way of international aid because it did not allow foreign entities to manage aid programs. Let's just say that the regime wanted to manage at all costs the resources and money that were arriving to mitigate the famine, which many interpreted as an attempt to divert part of that aid to other objectives that were not precisely about saving lives. But the worst was yet to come. 3 years later, in 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test, which was accompanied by the first package of economic sanctions against the country, approved by the UN, as well as unilateral sanctions by several countries. And while it may come as a surprise to many of you, up until 2006, which is basically the day before yesterday, North Korea had an economy perfectly capable of importing and exporting whatever it wanted, with almost no limitations. Since its first nuclear test, however, that has completely changed. North Korea has been punished by more and more UN Security Council resolutions with sanctions. The crux of the matter is not so much the sanctions, but the regime's decision to self-immolate by launching a large-scale nuclear development program in the midst of a famine and completely ignoring international reactions. And you know what? From a political point of view, this strategy may have made sense for the regime. The proof? 20 years later, in 2023, the regime is still standing. Even so, from the point of view of its own people and economy, the idea could not have been worse. Following the Great Famine, partly as a result of the collapse of the communist bloc and North Korea's fall in competitiveness, the country never recovered. After the brutal fall experienced in the 1990s, its GDP per capita is still at the same level as it was in the 1960s. We are talking about 6 lost decades. Well, there you have the reasons why North Korea, the former rising star of socialism, ended up becoming its greatest embarrassment. The question is, will this situation last forever? At the moment, there are no changes in sight. But, as you know, the Korean Peninsula is a place we talk about a lot on VisualPolitik, so we'll keep an eye on it. For now, we invite you to participate in this debate, leaving your thoughts below in the comments. And of course, if you liked this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any news. Once again, thank you for being there. All the best. See you next time.